In the spring of 1847, a whaling vessel departed the harbor at New Bedford. Her crew prepared for an extended season hunting the great leviathans of the North Atlantic. Initially, the voyage proceeded as countless others had before it. Sails were properly trimmed, casts methodically counted, harpoons honed to razor sharpness upon whetstones worn smooth by generations of use. Yet within a fortnight, the sea began revealing secrets that no chart had ever recorded, no sailor's tale had ever truly captured. A young calf surfaced bearing wounds of inexplicable origin and character. Strange luminescence stirred beneath the hull during the darkest watches of night. Lines returned from the depths scorched with marks that defied all rational explanation. The crew maintained their discipline and routine as best they could, but the ocean, in its ancient and unfathomable wisdom, had devised other plans entirely. Something vast and terrible was ascending from the abyssal depths, and the ship would not return unchanged, if indeed she returned at all. We cleared New Bedford Harbor in late spring with a steady wind blowing off the Massachusetts coast, and a pale sky that augured well for a clean passage to the Grand Banks. The vessel was the Albatross, stout in her hull and heavy in her timbers from years of demanding service in the harshest waters. The try-works had been meticulously scrubbed and properly banked. The whaleboats hung secure in their davits, and the deck carried that distinctive scent of seasoned oak, salt spray, and aged whale oil that marks every vessel in the trade. I was in my third year serving before the mast and maintained the noon sightings and the night log entries when the mate's attention was required elsewhere. The crew represented a blend of men from many coasts and nations, as is common in the whaling trade. Captain Bowen possessed broad shoulders, distinguished gray at the temples, and a voice that commanded respect without ever requiring him to raise it above normal conversation. Mr. Reed, our first mate, kept the watches with a habit of brief, pointed questions and swift inspections of all gear and equipment. Luis, an Azorian harpooner of considerable reputation, ran a whetstone over his irons every morning without fail, and spoke sparingly unless the matter warranted genuine comment. King, our boat steerer, moved with deliberate, careful precision, and possessed a manner of speaking that diffused quarrels before they could escalate. Sutter seemed constitutionally incapable of remaining still, and boasted far more than prudence would recommend. Daly, the ship's cooper, said remarkably little, yet observed absolutely everything with keen, calculating eyes. Esteban, the cook, maintained his galley spotlessly clean, and ensured we never miss a proper meal, regardless of conditions. The sea ran sharp and cold as we passed eastward the Nantucket shoals. We took a school of pilot fish on the third day and dried racks of cod that came up on the morning lines. The labor kept our hands warm and our backs steady against the chill Atlantic air. Lines were carefully coiled in their tubs and greased against the salt. Oars were inspected for splits or weakness. Thole pins were replaced where necessary. Mast steps were measured for any dangerous looseness. The captain personally inspected the spare heads of the irons and laid his experienced hand upon each whaleboat's keel to feel for any concerning give in the timbers. He never spoke of luck or omens, subjects that some seafaring men consider essential. Instead, he counted casts with precision and checked lashings with methodical thoroughness that inspired confidence. By the time we reached the banks, a low fog settled upon the water each noon and lifted again at dusk, as predictable as the tides. We took soundings regularly and marked each day's run with chalk upon the slate. Birds came and departed in substantial numbers, feeding at the edges where opposing currents pulled in contrary directions, creating rich feeding grounds. The crew settled gradually into the familiar rhythm of watch and rest that defines life aboard a whaling vessel. Reed kept me on the dog watch for a full week, then reassigned me to the night watches with King. I found the night air agreeable and appreciated the clear, unchanging steps of routine that varied only when circumstances absolutely demanded it. We waited for whales and the signal that would see the boats lower for chase. On the sixth day beyond the banks, we observed the first indication that something was distinctly amiss. A gray right whale surfaced off our port side at a distance of approximately 3 cables length, rolling with that slow, characteristic motion that exposed her flank to our observation. The hide bore a ring of perfectly round wounds, evenly spaced, each set deep and clean into the flesh. These were categorically not tooth marks from any shark, which invariably leave torn edges and pulled skin where the teeth have raked the flesh. These wounds were circular and smooth, almost surgical in their precision. The calf rolled once more in dough without raising her flukes above the surface, behavior that struck me as distinctly wrong for a healthy animal of that species. Luis observed from the main chains with his glass and maintained an uncharacteristic silence. When he finally descended, he meticulously washed the glass with fresh water and stowed away without offering any comment whatsoever, which I found rather more unsettling than any speculation might have been. That night, the wind diminished to barely more than a low breath that scarcely filled the sails. The sea itself wasn't flat, but the swell refused to break properly. We lay mostly quiet except for the familiar creak of rigging and the soft knock of blocks swaying gently against masts and spars. During the middle watch, I stood with King by the lee rail, and he directed my attention to a faint glow beneath the surface off the quarter, not particularly large, moving in concert with the set of the current. It wasn't the rolling, diffuse light one observes when the plankton bloom in their millions. This illumination held a definite, steady form for a considerable time, then dimmed and brightened in a slow, measured pulse before drifting beneath the ship and vanishing from sight entirely. We maintained silence for quite some time, each absorbed in our own thoughts. When King finally spoke, he remarked only that currents carry many peculiar things, which seemed a deliberate understatement. Morning brought fresh wind and a chop that slapped rhythmically against the forefoot. The captain altered course a few points northward to avoid a dense patch of fog that clung stubbornly to the horizon. Around noon, Esteban called urgently from the galley and pointed off the bow. A substantial patch of torn flesh floated there, large enough to fill one of our whaleboats entirely. The edges were remarkably smooth rather than ragged, as one would expect from a predator's feeding. We hove to and used boat hooks to bring it alongside for closer examination. The flesh proved pale and peculiarly rubbery, with long fibers that separated in stringy sections when pulled. On one side, near the ragged edge, a hard plate sat embedded at an angle in the tissue. Daly worked at it with a marlin spike and eventually freed it from the surrounding flesh. The object was remarkably dense and curved, with a rough ridge running along its length. Luis ran his thumb thoughtfully along the edge and pronounced it a beak. He claimed to have observed something vaguely similar, once near Fial in the Azores, though never remotely approaching this size. We allowed the torn flesh to drift away on the current and thoroughly cleaned the deck with seawater. The captain refused to characterize the discovery as either sign or warning. Instead, he ordered a meticulous check of all the lines and fresh lashings on every spare oar. He instructed me to mark the precise position in the log and to note the exact color and texture of the flesh with particular care. Captain Bowen possessed the valuable quality of remaining focused upon what he could directly observe and physically touch, never allowing speculation to cloud his judgment. Reed followed his captain's lead admirably and kept the men occupied with productive work. Even Sutter quieted temporarily and attended to his splice work with uncharacteristic care and attention. 2 days subsequently, the wind veered and built steadily through the afternoon hours. The sea transformed, taking on a different character with waves setting in from the northeast. We shortened sail appropriately and rode the rise and fall with the bow burying itself periodically in the larger swells. The pumps demanded their share of our time and energy, though the hull remained fundamentally sound and took on water at no alarming rate. In the greenish light of late day, we lowered for a pod of sperm whales on the weather side. They appeared to be good size and moving with steady purpose. The boat struck the water cleanly, and we pulled with vigorous determination into proper position. Louis stood ready with his iron, and King set the bow perfectly straight for the approach. We had closed it within range where we could actually smell the distinctive breath of the whales when the lead animal rolled aside and revealed a torn dorsal fin bearing a deep ring mark that ran from one edge clear to the other. The whale sounded immediately without the customary blow, and the entire pod altered heading in a scattered pattern that unmistakably resembled flight, rather than the usual diving behavior. I recognized fear in those massive animals, not confusion or mere caution, but genuine, visceral fear. The sea surrounding us filled rapidly with oil streaks and bits of shredded tissue floating on the surface. We pulled hard for a full hour and never succeeded in closing the distance again. Reed called us back as dusk approached and stated firmly that we would not pursue whales at night under these particular conditions. The mood aboard ship underwent a marked change following that incident. Men spoke considerably less about their anticipated shares of the profits and devoted more attention to repairs and watch orders. Daly relocated his tools to the leeward side where he could work in a crouch without risking small pieces rolling away with the ship's motion. Esteban began preparing heavier, more substantial meals and refused to allow any scraps to accumulate on the stern gratings, where they might attract unwanted attention. King inspected our lanterns twice each night, without fail, and kept fresh wicks in reserve at all times. The captain conducted quiet, private conversations with each boat's crew and thoroughly reviewed all signals with Reed. He never addressed us as children or fools requiring simple explanations. He spoke to us as men who required clear, unambiguous rules for navigating dangerous waters. On the ninth night, following our first observation of the marked calf, the sea moderated once more to a low, gentle heave. A heavy line suddenly came taut against the hull on the starboard side without any apparent cause. Reed and I proceeded to the rail with a lantern to investigate. A hawser that we normally kept coiled and securely lashed to the rail had somehow shifted position and fed out through a chock. The free end hung suspended in the dark water below. The section near the hull bore fresh were marks. Not the rough scuffing one expects from contact with a plank edge, but rather a series of round scars arranged in precise line, pitted and peculiarly polished in appearance. We hauled the line back, aboard with considerable effort. The free end had been systematically crushed and twisted until the inner fibers had splayed outward in all directions. The damaged fibers were thoroughly covered in a clear, viscous film that proved slick to the touch and carried a distinct, faint ammonia smell that stung the nostrils. Reed maintained his silence and carried the damaged line directly to Daly for his expert assessment. Daly carefully scraped the mysterious film with his knife and observed how it beaded and dried upon contact with air. He secured the hawser in a new position with proper tension and added a second lashing for additional security, clearly taking no chances. At dawn, we observed an extensive field of air bubbles rising in slow, deliberate bursts off the port bow. The bubbles maintained a definite shape for an extended period and clearly originated from a depth beyond what we could reach with our sounding lines. They followed our course for approximately half an hour before finally falling away astern. The birds that shadowed our vessel for days suddenly turned wide in their flight patterns and conspicuously refused to cross that particular patch of disturbed water. Louis watched the strange phenomenon as though attempting to read some message inscribed upon the waves, then deliberately put his glass away without offering any interpretation. The captain maintained a steady course north by east. He carried orders to fill our casks with oil and satisfy the owners back in New Bedford. And he possessed a professional sense that our best opportunity lay along that belt of cold water where the great whales congregated. Nevertheless, he quietly adjusted the watches to ensure no man spent extended periods alone on deck, and he kept the boats perpetually ready to drop in considerably less than a minute if the situation demanded it. He instructed us to double the lashings on the rudder chains and personally inspect the pintles and gudgeons for any developing cracks or weaknesses. He instituted a second anchor watch on nights when the wind fell to minimal levels. My own thoughts underwent a transformation that I carefully avoided articulating aloud to my shipmates. I had accumulated sufficient time at sea to understand the proper weight of hazard in its various forms, but this situation felt fundamentally different in character and quality. It didn't resemble a brewing gale, dangerous ice, or a threatening lee shore. All hazards I understood and could mentally prepare for. Rather, it felt like a coordinated set of movements occurring all around us that we couldn't chart on any map or predict through experience. I recorded only what I could directly witness in the official log and deliberately omitted the portions that possessed no objective measure, knowing how such speculation might appear to those who would read it later. On the 11th day beyond the banks, during the forenoon watch, we sighted a massive form ahead that initially appeared to be drift ice. It lay low in the water and presented a pale surface marked with numerous scars and long, deep grooves. As we drew progressively nearer, the object shifted position and rolled despite there being no swell of sufficient size to push something of that evident mass. We soon realized we were observing the body of an enormous squid, considerably larger than any specimen I had previously encountered in all my years at sea. The mantle had been violently torn open, exposing the internal structures. The arms were entirely missing beyond their bases, severed so cleanly that the cuts appeared almost deliberate. The head had been crushed severely on one side, and the eye socket on that damaged side was completely empty, with torn tissue hanging loose. In the other socket, the eye remained clouded and glossy, holding its spherical shape, but utterly devoid of life or intelligence. The massive beak gaped and closed rhythmically in the wash, not from any intent or remaining vitality, but purely from the mechanical motion of the water flowing past. We declined to attempt hooking the carcass for a closer examination. We passed within 2 ships' lengths of the gruesome discovery and maintained our course. Sutter began to speak, then abruptly stopped himself. Reed instructed him firmly to maintain his position and keep silent. The captain observed the floating carnage for a long moment, then ordered the boats prepared for immediate lowering, not to approach the carcass, but rather to be thoroughly ready for whatever had hunted and killed such a formidable creature. He didn't elaborate his order with unnecessary discussion. He stated only that no sensible man desired to be caught unprepared, which struck me as considerable understatement. That afternoon, light rain began falling, and the wind backed once more. We made minimal sail and proceeded at reduced speed. The pumps remained blessedly quiet. The crew moved with controlled, deliberate pace, and no man wasted a single step or motion. Esteban sent up broth and dry biscuit to provide warmth and sustenance. King meticulously checked the boat plugs and positioned spare oars within immediate reach. Daly hammered 2 new chocks near the stern specifically to prevent lines from slipping overboard unnoticed. The captain personally reviewed the signal gun and verified that the powder remained absolutely dry and ready for use. Near dusk, the lead line came up bearing a smear of clear jelly clinging to the knots. It stretched when touched and left a painful sting on the skin when Reed inadvertently brushed against it. He swore once under his breath, quite uncharacteristic for him, and washed his hands repeatedly with seawater until the burning sensation finally subsided. Luis requested to examine the line and smelled it carefully without making direct contact. He returned it without commentary and took a position in the bow, staring intently into the fading light. His weathered face held an expression of tight focus I had never previously observed in him, which I found deeply unsettling. We observed no whales whatsoever the following day. The sea lay beneath a high, clear sky, and the swell ran long and remarkably even. The silence and stillness possessed their own peculiar kind of pressure. When the ship creaked, as all wooden vessels do constantly, men glanced up sharply from their work. When water slapped against the hull in the most ordinary fashion, heads turned immediately. No one spoke directly about their concerns. The captain issued no verbal order for heightened vigilance that day, yet the deck responded to his unspoken expectations without the slightest friction or resistance. Reed quietly corrected a lashing here, adjusted a coil there, and maintained his voice at consistently low volumes. Towards evening, during my trick at the helm, the rudder shook in my hands in a manner I had never felt before. It wasn't the sharp snap produced by a wave striking, nor the gradual drag of accumulated weed on the rudder. Rather, it was a steady, powerful pull port followed by an equally deliberate release. The chains running to the tiller visibly strained and then relaxed. The captain materialized at my side and laid his experienced hand upon the tiller. He felt the disturbance as clearly as I had. He studied the wake trailing behind us and examined the water beneath the stern with intense concentration. He said absolutely nothing. He called for the lanterns to be lit considerably earlier than usual and for the boats to be swung out in their davits and left in a state of complete readiness. He remained standing at the stern until full darkness had fallen across the water. Only then did he descend below for what I knew would be a brief rest at most. I went off watch with my mind operating at an unusually high pitch that refused to ease despite food or hot tea. I lay in my bunk and listened to the hull speaking its usual language of creaks and groans. The familiar sounds felt like waiting for a knock upon a door that might never come, or might come at any moment. When sleep finally came, it proved shallow and brief, offering no real rest. At midnight precisely, King shook my shoulder firmly and instructed me to come on deck immediately. His voice remained characteristically calm, but his hand conveyed unmistakable urgency. I pulled on my jacket and boots hastily and climbed a ladder to the deck. The deck held only the low blue glow from our carefully trimmed lamps, and the sky had cleared sufficiently to reveal a scattered handful of stars. Men stood positioned at the rails in complete silence, not from any fear of making noise, but because words offered absolutely no useful purpose under the circumstances. Reed pointed wordlessly toward the stern. Behind us, at a distance difficult to judge accurately in the minimal light, a line of dim shapes rose and fell in a distinctly unnatural pattern. These were categorically not waves. They were mounds, long and unnaturally smooth, that lifted and sank without breaking as proper waves should. Each mound pushed a small wake as it moved. Between them, the water boiled periodically in short bursts that resembled air being forcibly expelled from considerable depth. The shapes maintained perfect pace with our vessel. No one shouted. No one attempted jokes to ease the tension. The captain appeared on deck, quickly assessed the situation, and issued a series of calm, clear orders. Bolt plugs to be checked once more, axes to be laid ready beside each mast, signal gun to be loaded, second helm line to be rigged as backup should the chains fail, and for me to stand by the log and measure our current speed with precision. We were making 3 knots under minimal sail. The mysterious shapes maintained their position relative to us with disturbing consistency. The early anomalies we had observed were well past the point where we could reasonably dismiss them. We were indisputably being followed. We couldn't identify our pursuer with any certainty. We could only confirm that it was large, close, and actively tracking our movements. The men maintained focus on their assigned work. The officers kept their orders clear and unambiguous. The ship moved steadily forward into a night that seemed to swallow sound and offer no answers to our unspoken questions. I set the log carefully, marked our position on the slate, and settled in to wait for whatever would reveal itself next. The shapes held their positions relative to us until the watch changed. No voices were raised and no man abandoned his post without explicit permission. The captain maintained our steady course and minimal sail. At the second dog watch, he ordered coffee for all hands, an unusual gesture that spoke volumes. Esteban moved with quick efficiency. The tin cups made small sounds against the galley rail that seemed extraordinarily loud in the oppressive quiet. When I accepted my cup, he held my gaze and gave a short, firm nod. That small gesture of solidarity helped more than the actual warmth of the drink. Near 2 bells into the middle watch, the first definitive contact occurred. It began as a rise beneath the stern that physically lifted the rudder and then allowed it to drop back. The tiller jerked violently in the helmsman's hands, and the chains rang out like bells. The next lift came from the quarter, rolling the ship several degrees and setting the boats to creaking ominously in their davits. Reed shouted for men to man the falls to steady the boats without actually lowering them. We braced them with short lines to prevent them swinging wildly. The rise came again, this time directly beneath the forefoot. The bow lifted substantially and settled back. The hull produced its characteristic deep groan that I had only heard previously in the heaviest seas. This sound wasn't caused by waves. It resulted from tremendous force being applied from depth. Louis seized a boat hook and leaned carefully over the lee rail when the water swelled nearby. He dipped the hook and raised it slowly. Clear strands of some substance clung to the iron. He held it to his nose, then extended it toward mine. It smelled identical to the material we had scraped from the lead line. He wiped the hook clean with a rag that he immediately threw overboard. His face betrayed no emotion, but his jaw worked once in a manner that suggested profound concern. The captain ordered a sea anchor deployed astern with the specific intention of fouling anything that approached too closely. Daly and I lashed 3 spare casts together with short sections of chain and bent on a length of hawser, with a grapnel secured at the end. We meticulously checked every knot and eased the improvised drag over the stern. The casks took the strain and settled behind us in our wake. The ship slowed fractionally. The mounds of the surrounding water adjusted their positions and maintained their relative distance with disturbing precision. The sea anchor swung once, then steadied. A low, resonant sound traveled directly through the hull. Not a voice, not a knock, but rather a series of pressure waves applied and released like a massive hand pressing against the door. The men instinctively looked downward, though there was nothing visible except black water and the faint phosphorescence of our wake. The drag line suddenly jerked violently. The hawser went taut. The stern dipped noticeably. Blocks groaned under the unexpected strain. Reed shouted urgently for axes. Daly and I sprinted to the bitts where the line was secured. The hawser thrummed beneath my palm like a living thing. When I tested its tension, it felt as though something impossibly powerful had seized the other end. The stern post creaked alarmingly. The captain gave the order to cut immediately. We chopped cleanly and allowed the hawser to run free. It smoked against the rail from friction, and then went suddenly slack as the final turns whipped free. The casks vanished into the darkness. The mounds visible in the water dropped away momentarily, then resumed their formation. We stood with axes ready and waited tensely for the next assault. It didn't come immediately. The captain instructed King to fire the signal gun over the stern, not as a call for assistance, which would be futile in these waters, but as a demonstration of our capacity for resistance. The flash briefly illuminated the water. In that fleeting moment of light, I glimpsed a pale shape turning just below the surface. It wasn't smooth like a whale. It possessed edges and lines that crossed in geometric patterns like overlapping plates. The water closed over it. The sound of the discharge rolled outward and was swallowed by the darkness. Dawn arrived slowly and without drama. Light haze lay upon the water like a shroud. The shapes that had paced us through the night sank from sight with the returning light. But the profound sense of being stalked and observed didn't lift in the slightest. The captain assembled all hands and laid out a clear operational plan. Boats would not be lowered unless we sighted whales that offered a genuinely clean opportunity for a successful hunt. The stern guard would maintain 2 men with axes at all hours. The rudder chains would be monitored without pause. No lines would be allowed to trail in the water. No scraps of any kind would remain on deck. Sutter began to question why we didn't simply turn for home immediately. Reed cut him off sharply and stated that the ship would not run blindly through waters we couldn't properly read or understand. The captain allowed that assessment to stand without elaboration. By mid-morning, the sea displayed new anomalies. Parallel tracks cut across the surface off the port beam, each approximately a ship's length, straight as if drawn with a ruler, then gone. We observed 4 distinct sets at irregular intervals. Birds flew across these tracks and rose again without pause, clearly disturbed by something. Luis watched through his glass and finally admitted he couldn't identify what had created them. We continued our work, but the character of that work had fundamentally changed. We lashed far more than we typically would. We stowed items twice. We checked the same fastenings repeatedly because no one trusted anything to remain where it should if left unattended. The order and routine helped immeasurably. Order provides hands with purposeful occupation when minds threaten to spiral into unproductive speculation. At noon, the log showed minimal ground covered. The captain declined to press additional sail. He maintained a margin of maneuverability he could trust absolutely. He instructed me to copy the previous day's entries into a second logbook in case the first went overboard, something he only did in heavy weather or when risk felt immediate and substantial. I understood the significance of that instruction perfectly. I wrote with meticulous care and didn't allow my hand to tremble. Early in the second dog watch, the water off the starboard quarter lifted and opened dramatically. A column rose, not resembling a whale spout in the slightest, but rather a thick surge that brought clear gel and quantities of fine bubbles to the surface. The smell struck us with physical force. It stung the eyes severely and caught in the back of the throat. Esteban swore colorfully and pulled his apron over his nose and mouth for protection. The column collapsed and left patches of gel that clung tenaciously to our planks. We washed them away with bucket after bucket of seawater. The gel refused to disperse with a single rinse. It smeared across the wood and required vigorous scrubbing with brushes. Daly eventually resorted to using a scraper on the worst accumulations. His forearms reddened severely where spray had made contact with the skin. Sutter conspicuously refused to approach the rail while we cleaned. He claimed his back pained him and held his side, like a man suffering from cracked ribs. No one believed his transparent excuse for a moment. Reed instructed him to fetch fresh water, and he took twice the necessary time. When he finally returned, he hadn't even filled the buckets completely. At sunset, the wind eased once more. The captain ordered lanterns positioned along both rails and at all mastheads. He had King retrieve the spare powder and shot and secure them in a cabin where dampness couldn't compromise them. He told me to rest for 2 hours and then return to stand at midnight to fore watch with him personally. I lay down fully clothed and didn't manage to sleep at all. When I appeared on deck at midnight, the water carried a faint, pulsing glow beneath the starboard beam. It was considerably wider than the pulse we had observed on that first disturbing night. It moved in parallel with our vessel, and then crossed beneath us to the lee side and back again in a deliberate pattern. The glow maintained a definite structure, brighter in distinct bands with darker sections between. It turned once, and the bands shifted like shutters or louvers being adjusted. I couldn't determine what generated them or what purpose they might serve. At 2 bells, the helm went simultaneously light and then heavy. The ship's heading fell off 2 points. The helmsman fought desperately to maintain control, and then something struck the rudder with tremendous, solid force. The tiller jumped violently, and the chain guard ripped free from one securing bolt. The captain shouted urgently for men to the stern. King and I seized the spare helm line and threw it over the tiller. We secured it on the opposite cleat and hauled with all our strength. The rudder came back approximately 1 point. The hull shook once more from aft, a deep, resonant impact that I felt through my boots. Reed was already positioned at the chains with a lantern. He peered over the rail and recoiled sharply as a pale appendage rose and slapped against the planks below the rail with a wet, meaty sound. It wasn't an arm in any human sense. It was a length of muscular flesh as wide as a man's chest, lined with round, sucking mouths that opened and closed rhythmically. They found purchase on the hull and made a distinctive sound like wet leather adhering to wood when they took hold. The end of this appendage remained invisible beneath the surface. Another length rose beside the first and searched methodically along the planks with disturbing intelligence. It located a seam between timbers and pressed deliberately. Nails creaked ominously under the strain. King raised an axe and struck down forcefully on the nearest of the round mouths. The blade bit deep and stuck momentarily. Clear fluid sprayed outward. The appendage recoiled violently, and the axe tore free with a sucking sound. More lengths rose, not rapidly, but with deliberate, purposeful movements. They searched systematically for purchase, found it, and pulled with coordinated effort. The hull listed several degrees as the starboard side took enormous strain. The boats suspended in their davits groaned alarmingly. Reed shouted for men to man. The larboard falls to balance the dangerous roll. Men responded immediately. No one froze or hesitated. Daly arrived with a broad chisel and began hammering methodically at the nail heads near where the mouths had secured their grip. When the nails finally gave way, the mouths lost their purchase and slid reluctantly free. We chipped and chopped frantically. Clear fluid spread across the planks. It stung exposed skin severely. Hands burned painfully. We worked regardless. The captain ordered the try-works lit immediately, our rendering equipment for processing whale blubber, but now pressed into desperate defensive service. Esteban and I had them ready within minutes. He poured whale oil, arranged dry kindling, and struck flame. Heat rose rapidly. Thick smoke rolled along the deck and streamed out to leeward. The intense glow from the fires threw harsh light across the rail where the appendages pressed their assault. The pale flesh withdrew approximately a foot from the searing heat. King observed this reaction and shouted to maintain the fires at maximum intensity. Esteban fed the flames with dry slats from a shattered cask. The iron pots heated until they glowed dull red. The air grew hotter than any night we had experienced during the entire voyage. Sweat ran into the chemical burns on my wrists and intensified the pain considerably. The appendages shifted their reach away from the try-works heat toward the stern section. One located the lower portion of the rudder and wrapped around it twice with terrible strength. The tiller went absolutely solid in our hands. The ship lost all steerage and yawed dangerously. The stern dropped noticeably. water climbed the taffrail and slapped across the deck. Men slid on the wet planks and caught desperately at cleats and fixtures. The captain instructed King to retrieve the small bomb lance from the weapons locker, essentially a grenade on a pole, designed for finishing wounded whales, but now our best weapon. We didn't carry many. They were expensive and reserved for whales, but this had ceased being an ordinary night long ago. King primed the lance carefully, checked the fuse mechanism, and met the captain's eyes. The captain nodded once, grimly. We secured a short line around King's waist, and 3 strong men took positions to anchor him. He lay flat on the deck with his chest extending over the taffrail, aimed down past the rudder assembly, and waited for the optimal moment. It came with a swell from below as the appendage tightened its grip, and the stern dipped once more under enormous pressure. He fired. The blast detonated underwater. The sound struck to the hull and into our very bodies as a massive, concussive thump. The grip on our rudder loosened immediately. The appendage uncoiled in a rapid, convulsive rush and slid away into the dark water. The water frothed violently with dark shapes turning and thrashing. The mound that had paced us for so long broke formation and scattered in apparent disarray. The helm came suddenly alive once more. The captain ordered hard to starboard to clear the cluster of disturbed water. We gained a point then, too. The ship moved steadily ahead into comparatively less troubled water. We maintained the try-works at full heat and kept axes readily at hand until dawn finally broke. No more appendages rose to assault the rail. The glow beneath the water moved progressively away and then faded entirely from view. The sun rose eventually on a flat, listless sea covered by thin haze. The deck bore clear testimony to the night's events. Burns on the planks from the creature's secretions, torn nail heads protruding from timbers, and streaks where the caustic fluid had dried to a dull, crystalline film. Our hands and forearms displayed small round burns that would develop into painful blisters by noon. The rudder chain showed alarming new marks from the tremendous strain they had endured. The lower gudgeon had developed a fresh crack that Daly carefully circled with chalk to monitor its progression. Sutter had conspicuously failed to approach the rail during the worst of the assault. He had crouched by the main mast and prayed continuously in a long, muttered string under his breath. When Reed finally ordered him to stand and carry buckets, he moved as though unable to hear the command. After dawn, when the immediate risk had lifted, he recovered his voice and argued strenuously that we should turn west for home immediately. Louise regarded him with a single, withering glance and then deliberately looked away, which spoke volumes. The captain stated that we would complete necessary repairs and then determine our course with clear heads, not in the immediate aftermath of crisis. We spent the entire day engaged in work that absolutely had to be accomplished and couldn't be postponed. We cooled the try-works and meticulously cleaned the rendering pots. Daly and I drove fresh nails where the creature's mouths had pulled the old ones loose from the timbers. Reed conducted a thorough inspection of the standing rigging with exceptional attention to detail and discovered nothing newly amiss or out of proper adjustment. King cleaned the bomb lance equipment comprehensively, carefully set aside the last 2 remaining charges, and wrote the inventory count in chalk inside the weapons locker for ready reference. Esteban boiled cloths in fresh water and treated our chemical burns with medicinal salve he ordinarily kept for galley scalds. It reduced the sharp pain somewhat. Near noon, we observed a substantial line of oil stretching across the surface to the north. It spread wide and lay remarkably steady on the calm water. The captain set a cautious course toward to determine whether whales might be feeding in the vicinity. As we drew progressively closer, the oil thickened considerably and carried small fragments of white tissue and clear gelatinous material. The smell intensified to almost overwhelming levels. We didn't observe any whales. What we did observe was a torn appendage, pale and enormously long, drifting independently on the current. The severed end was ragged where the bomb lance had torn through the flesh. The round mouth still open and closed without any apparent pattern, pure reflex action in dead tissue. We watched it pass at close range and declined to attempt bringing it aboard for examination. No one cheered our minor victory. No one declared the ordeal finished. The sea maintained its calm, inscrutable face, and the ship moved across it as though the previous night's horror had never occurred. The men moved with deliberate care and wasted absolutely no words on speculation. The captain wrote extensively in the official log, closed a leather-bound book, and instructed me to make a complete copy in the secondary record. I obeyed without question. I didn't know what the approaching night would bring. I knew only that the fundamental character of our voyage had been irrevocably altered and that we were far from finished with whatever had discovered us in these waters. The appendage we passed at noon didn't drift in isolation. By mid-afternoon, gulls wheeled low in great numbers and dove repeatedly at fragments floating in its wake. Some carried shreds of pale flesh in their beaks, dropping them to fight over in midair in raucous displays. The oil slick spread progressively wider across the surface. We steered well clear of the densest concentrations. The men observed and maintained silence. No one ventured to ask whether the creature had been killed. No one entertained that comforting delusion. That night, we kept lanterns burning brightly from bow to stern and posted double watches at all stations. The try-work stood ready with dry wood and whale oil for immediate ignition. King kept the remaining bomb lands primed and accessible, though the captain stated we would not discharge it unless pressed beyond any alternative. The sea lay unnaturally steady. No swell, no chop whatsoever. Every sound traveled with unnatural clarity across the still water. I could hear the scrape of Daly's chisel 2 decks distant as clearly as if he worked at my elbow. I could hear Esteban's low cough emanating from the galley. I could hear my own breathing considerably louder than it should have been. At 3 bells in the middle watch, the glow returned with vengeance. This time it manifested from both sides of the vessel simultaneously, not from one side alone. The bands of bioluminescent light were considerably sharper and more defined, resembling lines crossing at geometric angles. They moved deliberately beneath the hull and remained stationary relative to us, not drifting past as before. The ship slowed perceptibly despite full sails. The helm grew heavy once more. The tiller didn't jump violently this time, but pulled with steady, inexorable pressure as though physically restrained. Reed ordered men to the braces immediately. The captain issued no command to alter our course. He instructed us simply to hold position and observe carefully. Then came a sound from directly beneath the hull that chilled my blood. It wasn't the thump of impact we had experienced before. Rather, it was a scrape that traveled along the planks from bow to stern, slow and methodical and deliberate. The unmistakable sound of something measuring us, assessing us, learning our dimensions. The scraping ceased at the stern. The rudder chains tightened ominously. Then a violent jolt ran through the entire hull, and the stern dropped precipitously. The deck pitched at an alarming angle. Men stumbled and caught themselves desperately. Water washed over the lee rail in substantial quantity. A second jolt came, stronger than the first. The boats slammed against their davits with tremendous force. Reed shouted urgently for lines to secure them without lowering. The captain gave the cut order for the larboard boat. We released at the fall, hoping to ease a dangerous strain on the ship's structure. The boat struck the water and drifted astern. We watched with terrible anticipation. The glow shifted position and rose beneath the surface. A length of pale appendage surfaced directly under the drifting boat and split from keel to gunner-like kindling. The heavy timbers snapped with sounds like pistol shots. The halves sank rapidly. The glow descended with them. We observed a violent churn of water and the scatter of wooden fragments. Then everything stilled once more. The men positioned at the rail cursed under their breath in multiple languages. Louis stood absolutely silent. His hands remained clenched tight on his boat hook, knuckles white. Sutter began muttering about abandoning the hunt and returning to port. He repeated it again, considerably louder. Reed turned on him with barely controlled fury and informed him bluntly to keep his mouth shut or be physically gagged. No one raised objections to Reed's threat. At dawn, nothing showed astern. The sea ran flat and featureless. We had lost one boat, a relatively small loss compared to the night's other dangers, but conveyed an unmistakable message that the creature could take whatever it desired from us. The captain assembled us on deck. He stated plainly that we couldn't outpace our pursuer with sail alone, nor could we successfully fight in open, deep water where it possessed every advantage. He explained that our best opportunity for survival lay in reaching shallower waters, where its enormous bulk would have considerably less room to maneuver. He ordered a course west by north to reach the relatively shallow grounds near the Flemish Cap. No one raised any objection whatsoever. The days that followed brought steady wind. The ship made fair speed through moderate seas. The crew worked as ordered, but moved with an unnatural quiet most uncommon on a whaling vessel. Esteban prepared simple, plain food without his usual creative flourishes. Daly repaired whatever he could and spoke remarkably little. Luis continued sharpening his irons religiously, though we had observed no whales to strike for days. Sutter brooded in sullen silence, but kept his opinions to himself. King performed his duties with characteristic calm efficiency, but I observed his eyes involuntarily track to the stern each time he passed near it. On the third night from the wreck boat, we heard an entirely new sound. It was a deliberate knock from below, not random, but following a definite pattern. For distinct knocks, extended pause. For knocks repeated precisely. It traveled audibly from bow to stern along the hull. The men froze where they stood. Reed gripped the rail with white-knuckled intensity. The captain declared it was merely pressure on the planks from shifting currents. He instructed us firmly to maintain our positions and not respond with any sound whatsoever. We obeyed without question. The knocks came a third time, then ceased entirely. By morning, the hull displayed fresh weeping at multiple seams. Daly and I caulked them thoroughly with oakum and hot pitch. The water seeped in slowly but steadily. We kept the pumps operating continuously throughout the day. The men worked without complaint. None wanted to contemplate what those deliberate knocks might signify. On the fifth day, the wind dropped away completely, and we lay nearly motionless. The sea held long, glassy swells that moved beneath us without breaking. The sky dimmed strangely at noon, with a peculiar haze that refused to clear. We stood watch with lanterns lit well before sunset. At full darkness, the glow reappeared. This time it didn't merely pace us. It circled deliberately. Bands of light move around the hull in a wide, constricting ring. They pulsed bright and dim in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The ship rocked with regular pushes from below. The captain ordered all hands to battle stations immediately. The try-works fires flared high and hot. Axes lay distributed and ready. The final bomb lance stood primed. The glow tightened its ring progressively. The water surrounding us began to boil with rising air and disturbed sediment. A deep, resonant groan emanated from below, long and low like massive timbers bent far beyond their tolerance. Then the first devastating strike hit. The bow lifted 3 full feet and slammed down violently. Men fell heavily to their knees. Another strike came at the quarter. The rail split completely at one stanchion. Then appendages rose, more than we'd seen before, pale and thick as tree trunks, reaching high over the deck. They searched with terrible intelligence, found rigging and pulled with coordinated strength. Sails tore with ripping sounds. Blocks snapped and fell. One appendage wrapped entirely around the foremast and squeezed until the spar cracked with a sound like musket fire. The mast listed dangerously, but held by some miracle. Reed shouted for axes to the foremast. Men hacked frantically at the constricting flesh. Clear caustic fluid sprayed in all directions. The flesh quivered under our assault, but refused to release its grip. Louis seized a whaling lance and drove it deep with all his considerable strength. The appendage recoiled halfway, but still maintained its crushing hold. Another length swept horizontally across the deck. It struck Sutter full body and hurled him against the rail. His body broke the stanchion and went overboard with barely a splash. He never surfaced. No one had time to mourn. The captain shouted urgently for bomb lance. King took his established position by the taffrail once more. He fired directly into the base of one massive appendage that held the foremast. The blast shook the deck violently. The appendage tore loose and thrashed wildly across the deck before sliding back into the sea, trailing dark ichor. Another length rose and wrapped the shattered rail. Luis and Reed attacked it together with axes and lances. The ship rolled hard to larboard. Water poured over the rail in torrents. Barrels broke loose from their lashings and slammed against the bulwarks with tremendous force. The pumps were completely overwhelmed by incoming water. Men scrambled desperately to maintain their footing on the tilting deck. Daly shouted that the seams were opening catastrophically. The captain gave the order every sailor dreads above all others. He commanded us to cut the remaining boats free and abandon ship immediately. He stated bluntly that the Albatross would not hold together. Reed repeated the dreadful order for absolute clarity. Luis looked once at the captain and nodded in silent understanding. King cursed once under his breath and sprinted to his designated station. We slashed desperately at the falls and dropped 2 boats cleanly. Men piled in with frantic haste. I went with King. Daly came after. Luis remained to the captain, and Reed to cut the 3rd boat free. Esteban brought the powder box and tossed it in before climbing down himself. Appendages still rose and fell all around us in the darkness. The glow illuminated the sea in pulsing bands. The ship groaned like a dying leviathan. I glanced back once as our oars bit water. I saw the Albatross roll heavily to starboard, the broken foremast falling, the deck swarming with pale appendages. The captain stood resolute at the rail, with a lance gripped in his capable hands. Reed shouted commands at men in the last boat. Then the ship heeled farther. Water rushed across the deck. The glow flared intensely bright, and the sea boiled furiously. We pulled hard into absolute darkness with the terrible glow behind us. We didn't look back again. We rowed until our arms trembled with complete exhaustion. The glow behind us gradually faded, but the sea still moved in disturbed patterns that carried far. No one spoke above a whisper. The night air burned our throats from the acrid fumes of oil smoke and chemical secretions. When dawn finally came, the horizon showed clear in every direction. No sail, no mast, no floating wreckage whatsoever. The Albatross was gone entirely. We had 2 boats with 7 men distributed between them. King steered one, Reed the other. Esteban clutched the powder box desperately, though the charges had been thoroughly soaked and rendered nearly useless. Daly kept the water breaker secured tight between his knees. Louis sat in grim silence in Reed's boat with his harpoon laid across his lap. His experienced eyes never left the surrounding sea. We rigged a small sail from spare cloth and bent it to the mast. The wind provided slow headway westward. Reed kept the 2 boats in close proximity and set a course he calculated would bring us toward the cap if the wind held reasonably steady. We shared water in carefully measured small cups. The biscuit was thoroughly damp, but sufficient to maintain our strength. By the 2nd day adrift, the men's hands blistered severely from salt and constant rope work. Esteban's voice cracked from thirst, though he voiced no complaint. King remained steady at the tiller, his face set in an expression of calm determination I couldn't fully interpret. Daly counted the biscuit pieces twice and wrapped them carefully in cloth against spray. I took sights at noon with the spare sextant and attempted to reckon our position. The mathematics provided me little comfort regarding our prospects. On the 3rd night adrift, the glow returned, fainter and farther away, but unmistakably there. Bands of pale light moved beneath the surface behind us. Reed cursed once and instructed us to maintain rowing. Keep the sails taut, make westward while we retain the strength. Luis lifted his harpoon and set the point against his knee. He didn't move again throughout that entire night. The glow followed until dawn, then sank from sight once more. The men's nerves frayed progressively. Esteban muttered prayers continuously under his breath. Daly asked Reed whether we should jettison weight to gain speed. Reed told him bluntly that nothing we carried would materially change the outcome. King stated firmly we would not discard food or water. Esteban glared but held his tongue. On the 5th day, the sea changed color distinctly at noon. Patches of oil drifted across the surface. Birds gathered in extraordinary numbers and dove repeatedly. We pulled clear of the worst concentrations, but the smell clung to everything. The sky dimmed with haze by evening. The glow manifested again that night. Considerably closer this time, Reed separated the 2 boats, explaining that if the creature took one, the other might successfully escape. We didn't argue with his logic. I rowed until my shoulders burned with agony. My palms bled from the oar handles. When I glanced back, I observed the glow split into two distinct shapes. They circled and crossed beneath us in coordinated patterns. Reed shouted for absolute silence. We held perfectly still. The water boiled once at our stern, then subsided. The glow drifted gradually away into the haze. The seventh day brought a severe gale from the northwest. The sea built high and steep. The boats pitched and slammed violently. We secured ourselves with spare line. Reed's boat vanished in the spray more than once, then reappeared. At dusk, we lost sight of them entirely. Our small sail split, beyond repair. We cut it free and lay to the oars. Rain blinded us, and the sea battered at the gunwales relentlessly. By dawn, the gale had passed, but Reed's boat had vanished. We were four now: King, Daly, Esteban, and myself. The water breaker was half empty. The biscuit bag nearly exhausted. The powder box was soaked through and utterly useless. The harpoon had been lost overboard during the night. We rowed westward with our remaining strength. On the ninth day, Esteban began to rave incoherently. He claimed the glow was directly beneath us, said he could feel it through the planks. He rocked violently and shouted until King struck him once to restore quiet. He sat still afterward, but muttered continuously to himself. Daly kept his eyes fixed on the horizon. He refused to look downward. At midnight, the glow rose once more. It circled slowly, not rapidly. The water heaved beneath the boat, but didn't strike. King instructed us to remain absolutely still. We sat frozen as the glow moved beneath us, then away. It lingered at the edge of visibility until dawn broke. By the 12th day, we were utterly spent. Daly's hands bled continuously from the pump, though precious little water remained to bail. Esteban lay still, breathing shallowly. King still gripped the tiller, though we had no sail to steer. I marked the sun's position and estimated we weren't far from the banks. On the 13th morning, a sail showed on the western horizon. We pulled with the absolute last of our strength to close the gap. The ship was the Margaret out of Nantucket. They took us aboard, gaunt and burned, more bones than men. Daly wept openly when he touched solid deck. King thanked the mate formally and requested water. Esteban died before noon. We committed him to the sea without elaborate words. I related to the Margaret's captain what we had witnessed and endured. He listened, his weathered face utterly unreadable. Then he stated simply that men see much in hunger and fear. He recorded that we had lost the Albatross to a storm. I didn't argue or protest. I made my entries in the personal journal. I kept hidden and closed it. Luis, Reed, Captain Bowen, and all the rest were gone with the ship. We few survived, but the cost remained permanently with us. When I close my eyes at night, I still see the bands of light beneath the hull and feel the grip on the planks. I don't know whether we escaped or were deliberately spared. The sea, in its ancient wisdom and inscrutability, doesn't answer such questions. It keeps its secrets in the cold depths where light fails and pressure crushes. What rose from those depths to hunt us may still patrol those waters. I cannot say with certainty. I know only that I witnessed something that charts don't record and logs don't properly capture. Something vast and terrible and possessed a disturbing intelligence. The owners in New Bedford received their report of storm damage and accepted it without question. Insurance was paid. Another ship was commissioned. The whaling trade continued, as it always had. But I never returned to sea. I took work on land and kept my journal locked away. Sometimes on foggy nights when the wind carries the salt smell of the ocean, I wake in darkness and listen. And in that silence, I sometimes hear an echo of that sound, the deliberate knock from below. 4 times. Pause. 4 times again. The thing that measured us in the dark. The thing that followed us across empty leagues of ocean. The thing that took our ship and most of our crew. I pray it remains in those deep waters where we found it. I pray it doesn't follow ships into shallower grounds. I pray, though I'm not certain prayer reaches into those crushing depths where such things make their homes. This account I've written in my own hand, in my own words, without embellishment or exaggeration. I recorded what I saw, what I heard, what I felt beneath my hands as we fought for our lives. Whether anyone believes it matters little to me now. I was there. I survived. And I carry those memories like scars that never fully heal. The sea is vast beyond human comprehension. We sail upon its surface and imagine we understand it. We hunt its creatures and believe we're masters of that domain. But beneath the waves, in the cold and crushing dark, things move that dwarf our ships and mock our pretensions. We're visitors in that realm, tolerated at best, and sometimes, rarely, something rises from below to remind us of that fundamental truth. The Albatross sailed from New Bedford in the spring of 1847. She never returned. Her crew is listed as lost to storm in the official records. But storms don't knock on hulls and patterns. Storms don't hunt with intelligence. Storms don't measure ships with methodical precision before taking them apart. What took the Albatross wasn't a storm. It was something else entirely. Something the sea has kept hidden in its depths for reasons we cannot fathom. And it's still there, I believe, still circling in those dark waters, still waiting for the next ship to pass overhead, still patient in the way that only ancient things can be patient. This is my testimony. This is my warning. And this is why I never returned to sea. From the private journal of a survivor, dated 1847, discovered in a New Bedford estate sale, 1923.